Okay. So, how many times have you been to the Middle East?
Twice.
And why did you go each time?
So the first time I went was with the college program, and it was for 2 semesters, and we studied history and religion and politics and all those kinds of things.
And what made you want to go on that trip?
I looked at all the different overseas programs that my college had to offer. There was one to Kenya, which sounded really cool, get to go on safari. There was one in Micronesia. Did it stop?
Probably. Whatever.
College programs, master. Okay. So I looked at the one in Kenya. I looked at the one in Micronesia, getting to go on safari, or the one in Micronesia, they went scuba diving every day. And then I looked at the one in that went to the Middle East, and it was in Israel and Egypt, and it was led by a Presbyterian minister who was, well, he's an ordained minister, but wasn't practicing, he wasn't like preaching, and he was a biblical historian. And so he had friends who were Palestinians, he had friends that were Israelis, and it was an opportunity to get to live in a different culture and learn about it in a way that I would never get to do having been raised an American Jew. I had a very different perspective on all of those things, the history and religion and politics, and I knew I'd get to see and learn things in a way that would never be possible if I went there on my own, or if I went there with some American Jewish group or anything like that.
So was the minister from the Middle East?
Nope. He's a professor of Old and New Testament at Lewis and Clark College.
Was he helpful on the trip? Did he like teach you?
Oh, he taught us so much. The first month that we were there, we lived in Tel Aviv with Jewish families, and I did a homestay with an Orthodox Yemenite family, so they're from Yemen. They didn't speak English. One of the kids spoke a little bit of English. My Hebrew is not very good. And so we lived with them while we then went to university and learned a little bit of Hebrew, learned a little bit of Israeli culture. Do you care that that's...
It's fine.
Okay. And then after that first month, we moved from living with, I was living with an Orthodox Jewish family. We then moved to a hotel in the West Bank. It's in Jerusalem, but on the other side of the Green Line. And we would get out the Bible and read the story of Jericho, and then you go to Jericho, and then you read these stories that date back thousands of years, and then you get to go to those places. There was at the time of Jesus, there was this guy who was basically going around and just keeping a really cool diary. He was just writing everything he saw, and those writings still exist, and you can actually walk around the city and say, hey, when they talk about, the the Via Dolorosa that Jesus walked on when he carried the cross, and he went to the rock of Golgotha, and you actually follow this guy's description, and you can say, hey, that little hill that they're describing is just outside the city wall. That's actually where this stuff happened. So it was just such an amazing opportunity from learning history to get to go to where the origins of our modern history really start for Muslims, Jews, and Christians.
What were some of the biggest differences from either side of the line?
Perspective. Things were actually very different back then. This was 1986. Well, we left in 85 and we were there. Actually, no, I guess it started in January of 1986. And we were there until June. On the way there, we spent a week in Copenhagen, Denmark. We were supposed to go to Petra in Jordan, but Jordan canceled our visa because there were Jews in our group. And they were afraid that we would be a target for terrorists. And so we had to spend a week in Denmark. And coming from Portland, where, an old house is one that's 100 years old, and you go to Elsinore, where Hamlet is set, and you see these medieval castles, and you're like, wow, this is so cool, it's so old. And then you go to Israel, and you're like, wow, this is really old. And, it's instead of, it's Middle Ages, and then you get, eventually we spent a month doing an archaeological dig where we were digging up 3,000-year-old shards of pottery. And you can tell by the lip as to when it was, which age it was from. And you're like, somebody sat here and made this 3,000 years ago. It's just, it was such a different perspective. But back to your question. So everything about the politics and the history of Israel and the West Bank, it's like anything in history. One person's hero is another's villain. So the people who were the brave soldiers who liberated Israel and established the state for the Jewish people, they're a hero to people on one side of this line, and on the other side, these are people who came in and by force kicked them out of their homes. And they're both right. And that was what was so hard, was that all of these stories and all of this that I had always been taught was so black and white. I had been taught the American Jewish perspective, and that is that Israel is great, and it's the land of the Jews, and it's the place where Jews can be free and a part of the majority, and then you go and you meet the Palestinians, and it's much, much messier than anything I had ever learned or seen or really even thought. And even little things like water rights. You have a small country in the desert, and you have these people on the West Bank who are trying to eke out a living on these small farms, and they don't have water rights. And so who should have the right to the water? I mean, even if you ignore the which part of the land belongs to whom, even if you just say, okay, well, where the lines are now, fine, but who should get to water their farms? Everything was very messy. And back then there were a lot more terrorist attacks. What they did since then was they've made it so there's very little or often no interaction between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Back when I was there, there were a lot of Palestinians that were working in Israel, and there were Israeli companies that had their factories in the West Bank. And now there isn't that, and it stopped terrorism, but it's also bred a lot of ignorance, a lot of prejudice. They don't know each other.
Was it hard to see the Palestinian side, given that it was the opposite of what you'd always learned? Or like being there, could you see it?
I was conflicted. Met some really cool people, and that's tough when you see the human, when you actually, it's not statistics, it's not populations, it's not millions of people. It's like, look at this family, and look how they're living, and look, where they came from, and what are their hopes for the future. So, yeah, it was really hard to. It was hard to change my perspective.
Did you have the most inspirational moment or person you met?
My most inspirational moment was at night at the Western Wall in a rainstorm. I don't know why. It just...
What were you doing there?
Just walking around. I was just by myself. It was just, I don't know. It was a special moment. Nowadays I'm not sure that it's safe to just walk around in that area by yourself. And I mean, that's, that's right next to the Arab quarter. And so, I don't know what it's safety-wise now, but I felt safe. I was also 20 years old and might have been stupid.
How about people? Was there a coolest or a person that you connected to or remember the most?
There was a taxi driver in Cairo. He was probably the most charismatic person I've ever met. He loved Americans. Well, at least that's, he talked a good story. But very charismatic, loved Americans. And for the life of me, I couldn't figure out why driving down the freeway at 100 kilometers an hour, he kept turning off his headlights. And you would see this little tiny red dot in the distance getting closer and closer, but it just looks like the tiniest little LED. And as it gets closer, you realize it's the cigarette in a guy's mouth who's driving a car in the opposite directions with his headlights off. I tried to find out why they did that, and I didn't speak any Arabic, and his English was pretty broken. But
any streetlights or anything, or just
in some places?
So mostly just driving in the dark.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
I remember seeing that cigarette coming at me. We're going in opposite directions. It was moving fast. But so, yeah, we after we'd been in Israel for I think about 3 months, we went and spent 2 weeks in Egypt. First week I lived with a family in a Cairo high-rise. Cairo, I think at the time had like 14 million people or something. And we lived in this building where I was told by the family, do not talk to the operator or elevator.